Welcome to the Broken Pie Chart Podcast, episode number 27. I'm your host, Eric Moore, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about the federal budget, the debt, interest rate on debt, just what makes up the federal budget, and then what all these people are talking about with regard to, hey, if the deficit keeps going and gets out of control, our net interest payments are going to take over other parts of our deficit. And really, the impetus for this episode, someone recently said to me, I keep hearing about all this universal basic income, UBI proposals where the government would cut a check to each citizen over 18. I've heard about Medicaid for all. I've heard about Green New Deal. And one of the things they always hear people talking about is how it's going to be paid for. And he said to me, look, I listen to these people and they make all these arbitrary arguments. But if I just wanted to understand a little bit more about the facts and the numbers and how I would actually engage somebody and talk about what one side of the issue or another. And so he said, if you could do one of these where we get into a little bit of the numbers, it would sort of be helpful. And so today we'll do just that. And, one of the things I can start, and when we think about the federal budget, there's what normally happens is, so a president takes over. And so President Trump's first year with 2017, he gets elected, of course, in November of 16. His first year of the budget is pretty much the prior president's budget. And so his first real budget would have been, 2018, because 2017, they would have done that. There's some differences about how the budgets get done. President proposes a budget, and then Congress theoretically has to pass it. That's not exactly how it's worked the last couple of years, and sometimes they pass what's called continuing resolutions to continue to fund the government. But basically, there's two parts. There's what you're going to spend, and then there's the revenue that you're going to bring in. And so what you're going to spend is, let's say, a proposed budget. And so give you an example, and I'm going to have a lot of links on this episode because I didn't come up with all these numbers on my own. I brought them from different spots. But one of the, if we look at the 2020 budget proposal for the U.S. government, it's about $4.7 trillion. And the estimate, and I'll use air quotes here as I'm doing the thing with my fingers, right? The estimate for revenue is $3.7 trillion in revenue. And so right away, you're probably saying, wait a second, they're going to spend $4.7 trillion. They're only estimating to bring in $3.7 trillion in revenue. Doesn't that mean it's a deficit? Well, of course it does. And we've run deficits for many, many years in this country. To give you an example, in 2009, the deficit was $1.4 trillion. That was under President Obama. That was also in the year after the 2008 meltdown, right? And then last year, I believe the deficit was $779 billion. And so when there's a proposed budget, they're using estimates for, what they're going to bring in revenue, and then they have sort of a baseline of what they're going to spend. Of course, if there's something that comes up that wasn't planned, and theoretically they could spend more money than that, but that's sort of the budget, right? So when you're looking at the federal budget, and one of the things that people say, well, why don't they spend less on this, more on this? There's really three different main areas of the budget. There's what's called the mandatory section. And the mandatory spending is things like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, among other things. And mandatory just means, I heard somebody put it a different way. It's really the payments are on autopilot. There's no discretion on those. Those are being paid out in those programs. And to give you an example, it's about $2.8 trillion is, I think, what the last one was. Then there is discretionary payments, and discretionary would be, let's say, things like the military or, foreign aid, money set aside for disasters or to pay for wars, different things like that. And then there's what's called net interest payments, or really interest that's due on the debt. So all the debt that's outstanding, and we'll talk about the total debt in a little bit, that's what on an annual basis at the government it's going to to be spending on that. So the net interest payments are roughly $500 billion, $1.4 trillion in discretionary spending, $2.8 trillion in mandatory spending. And so when you look at the mandatory spending, about of the $2.8 trillion, about $1.1 trillion is Social Security, about $680 billion is Medicare, and about $418 billion is Medicaid. Discretionary is about $1.4 trillion, as I said. Of that, more than, probably the estimate's around $800 billion is military, and that includes everything from the actual military that you would think of. I believe the VA is wrapped up in there. I could be wrong, or Veterans Affairs. And then the other part of that is things like Department of Education, urban development, housing, health and human services. I think I'm missing another big one in there. But then, of course, you come to the net interest payments on the debt. As we said, that's roughly $500 billion, and I'll sort of get into those. So when you think about what the government is spending and what they're bringing in, of course, they are, or have been for some time, running a deficit. And they don't expect, when they submit a budget, it's not like they thought they'd get $4.7 trillion and then they wound up getting less. They're submitting budgets that are actually have a deficit built in. But certainly there's been deficits. I think the last time we had a surplus was during the tech boom in the late 90s to maybe right around 2000. And the debt is actually somewhat important because, as we're running deficits, we continue to add to the debt. But one of the interesting things is, and I'll just give you some numbers here, our current debt is about $22 trillion. And we have sort of the total debt, but then we also have this thing called total debt held by the public. And that's about $16.1 trillion. And if you're doing the math, that's a difference of about $5.9 trillion. The difference there is that debt, the difference is sort of this intergovernmental. And so different parts of the government borrow from one another. So it sort of owes the interest to itself. You'll see this with some of the social programs, Social Security. So theoretically, it owes the debt, but it's paying the debt to itself. It gets a little bit wonky on that. But when you hear about interest on the debt, right now our debt is about $22 trillion, and it's going up. So one of the things that is a measure of growth in the country is the idea of gross domestic product. So gross domestic product, you think about our economy, all the price of all the final finished goods in the U.S., and that was roughly $21 trillion in 2018. So if you look at total debt to GDP, meaning our debt, over the GDP, it's about 105%, which is the highest it's been since 1946, 1947, during one of the world wars and the Great New Deal and a lot of the things that Roosevelt spent a ton of money on. And then you look at the percent of debt held by the public to GDP is 77%. So that's been on the rise. Both those numbers have been on the rise. And the forecasts are it's going to continue to go higher. So why do deficit matter? And when people talk about the deficit, what is really the issue here? Well, one of the real interesting points about debts and deficits is just this fact of what the interest payments are, the rate at which we pay interest. And so if you think about, historical data, and I'll link to this. This is from Treasury Direct, a government website. Looks like in 2018, about $523 billion was the net interest payments. And you go down and you say, well, okay, if I go back, let's say, to 2007 or 2008, it was about $450 billion. And one of the interesting parts about this whole thing is our debt. And so there's two ways to look at under presidents or under Congress or the Senates. There's the percentage increase of debt. So, if you had $8 trillion in debt, now you have $16 trillion. The president has increased it by 100%. The most in sort of a raw, not on a percentage basis, but the most amount added to the debt was under President Obama, although his percentage change, I think, was still lower than Reagan. Reagan was 100%. But generally, presidents have added to the national debt. And we say presidents, but of course, you have Congress and the Senate as well, meaning they're spending more than they are bringing in revenue. So the point I want to make about this is while our debt continues to increase and continues to, it's doubled, we haven't seen the amount of net interest payments, meaning the interest payments on the debt, grow quite as much. And one of the reasons why that is simply its interest rates are much lower. And so to give you a perspective on this, just pulling it up March of 2019, so that's this year, a couple of months ago, it's about 2.5%, call it 2.59% is the average interest rate paid by the U.S. government on its debt. In other words, they borrow money, right? We borrow money. I guess they. I'll call them they. They borrow money. Let's say they float another $1 trillion in bonds. They got to issue it, and they got to pay interest to the bondholders. And so the lower the interest rate, the lower that their total payments are. So if we look at the interest rate of March of 2019, I said it was about 2.5%. In December of 2007, it was almost 5%. And so the interest rate was double what it is today in 2007, even though our debt was much lower. And so that's one of the reasons why in 2007 we paid, let's see, $430 billion in interest. 2008 it was $450 billion. Today, last year was $458 billion, it was 2017, and then this year it looks $520 billion. So while debt has gone up, the interest payments have not gone up on a percent change to percent change basis, and the reason is the interest rates have been very low. And this is one of the risks that people point to. If interest rates were to go up, your net interest payments could go up a lot more. And so to give you an example, March of 2001, the interest rate on debt that was out there was about 6.4%. And so the way to look at this, let's say if interest rates double tomorrow, it doesn't mean that all the bonds, all the interest that is paid would double, because you've got all this debt out there. As you add new debt, you would have to pay more in interest on that debt. And then what happens is as bonds mature, theoretically, right, the U.S. government owes the bondholders their principal back, their $1,000 per bond or their par value, but they don't pay off the bonds. What they do is they float new debt to pay off the old bondholders. And so as you're sort of revolving their maturing debt and they're issuing new debt, you'd be doing it at higher rates. If you had a 30-year bond that was issued 30 years ago, that's all sort of, and now it's, coming due, all of those bonds sort of have a blended interest rate. So to give you some numbers on this, I took, the $523 billion, according to Treasury Direct, and the average interest rate was about 2.5%. If the average interest rate went up to 5%, well, our payments would be about $1.04 trillion. So you can kind of see the risk here is that if interest rates go up, and let's assume that debt stays constant, then the U.S. government could wind up paying quite a bit more. Now, I'm not going to make predictions, but I'm just going to assume that the government's going to keep spending more than it brings in. And if it does that, let's just put it into perspective. At a 2.5% interest rate, each additional $1 trillion means the U.S. government would have to pay $25 billion more annually in interest. And so you've got a combination of more debt coming on, being floated in the coming years, and then you also have the risk of interest rates going up. And I've heard some people, there was one advisor who was talking to a group and I think made the point that, our discretionary budget is $1.4 trillion. If we get a rise in interest rates and more debt, at some point, interest on the on the national debt could exceed discretionary spending. And so that's one of the risks out there. Remember, we've got really the three main pieces of the budget. Of a 4.7 proposed 2020 budget, 2.8 trillion in mandatory spending, 1.4 in discretionary, and well, this was 479 billion. I think it's going to be higher now, but you can sort of see if payments on interest go up, they would have to cut more in discretionary spending, or they would have to run a bigger deficit. Now, by the way, the flip side of this also is one of the arguments that a lot of people make is, generally, if you look at sort of the effective tax rate, and so remember, there's a lot of talk right now about going back to a 70 or a 90% tax rate. The reality is, and my understanding is, even when rates were 90% or 72% or 70%, the effective tax rate, meaning after deductions or different write-offs or whatever it is, loopholes, whatever you want to call them, the effective tax rate hasn't changed too much over the years. And in fact, the variance of the percentage collected of GDP over a number of different tax rates has not changed that much. There's a little bit of debate on that because, when you talk about taxes, you're also talking about Social Security taxes and things like that. But I bring this up because that's one of the arguments. If you get more growth, more GDP growth, and you're collecting sort of an average effective tax rate or percent of GDP, that's one of the arguments to make that growth could help narrow that budget deficit, right? So this brings me also to another point. And, one of the things that somebody asked me, I said, I've heard a lot about this universal basic income. And so if you haven't heard of the UBI or the universal basic income, it's the idea that we would, as a government, or the government would pay everybody, let's say, a monthly amount, and I think the amount that's been floated is something like $1,000 a month, and everybody would have just this. Every adult would have a universal basic income, and somebody was asking me, what would that cost? And so I was curious, and I looked at the numbers, and according to the 2010 census, there were 308 million people in the U.S. Again, this is according to the 2010 census. And from 2000 to 2010, of course, we won't have another one in 2020, but I think the growth was about just under 10% population growth. And so you look at this and you say, okay, the total was there, but then this idea of a universal basic income is to give $12,000 a year, $1,000 a month, right? It's the same thing. It's just math. To everyone over 18. There's 234,564,212 and 212, according to the 2010 census. And if you do the math, that's roughly about $2.8 trillion. So if you gave everyone $1,000 a month, that would add to the budget about $2.8 trillion. Now, if you say, well, we probably have more people than we had in 2010 in the country, and I saw an estimate of some numbers, and you do that math, it's about 3.1 trillion. So one of the things that right away you look at that, and in economics, there's this principle called all else being equal. And so you're just looking at sort of one component, and you're not saying what else would change. But all else equal, you would say you need to raise revenue by about 85%. In other words, if you had this thing go on, you would pay 3.1 trillion every year, or at least next year, according to those estimates. And if your revenue is only 3.7, you would have to raise an additional 85% of revenue, or you would have to increase the gap between what you spend and what you take in, meaning increase the national debt even more. So instead of $1 trillion, you could, if you didn't bring any more revenue in. And remember, I mentioned, there's a couple things out there that say generally there's a certain percentage or a range of a percent of GDP that you collect in revenue, irregardless of the tax rates. So maybe that'll be another episode. We can get into that. So the other question that somebody had for me, well, what if I guess somebody was on TV saying, hey, what if we just took the money from some of the corporations because they'll get the money back. I took a look, and one of the measures of sort of how much cash a company has is this thing called free cash flow. And free cash flow, the way to look at this, and I always explain it, let's say that you had a business and you owned a coffee shop and you sort of, only took cash, right? Let's just go with the analogy. You've got a cash register, kind of old school, and people come in, they give you money. And then obviously, as you collect revenue, you also have to pay for supplies. You have to pay for your employees, maybe you do some marketing, whatever it is. And so day one, January 1st, December 31st, you open up the cash register. And after you've paid all your expenses and done all your stuff and brought in all your sales, a good way of, that's kind of a good analogy. Your free cash flow is whatever is left over in your cash register at the end of the year. And so I just kind of took a look and I said, what if you sort of looked at some of the largest companies or the biggest, free cash flows for 2018. And I took a look and, Apple had free cash flow of about $64 billion, Boeing $13.6 billion, Walmart $18.2 billion, Amazon $17.3, Disney had $9 billion, Google $22.83 billion, Microsoft $32.25 billion, Exxon $16.4 billion. I think I got I have about 8 companies on this list. To give you an idea, if you took 100% of their free cash flow, those companies I just mentioned, it would still only add up to about $194 billion. And so, even if you took the free cash flow of a bunch of other companies, it'd be really tough to, if you took all their profits, right? If you took all their free cash flow, 100% of their free cash flow, you'd have to, the numbers don't really add up. So that's one way to looking at it. But I thought it was constructive just to, a lot of people have said, hey, I always hear these people on TV and they're always talking about all these different ideas and they try and talk about raising taxes, lowering taxes, doing a universal basic income, increasing benefits, decreasing benefits. And then, what's really the risk of rising interest rates, or what does adding all this debt actually do to potentially the other aspects of the budget? And you can see that the federal budget, obviously the proposals are a deficit. We've been running deficits. As I said, it was the highest I've seen, from what I can tell, is $1.4 trillion in 2009. In 2018, it was $779 billion. And our debt to GDP continues to rise. But that thing to keep an eye on, if debt plus interest rates rising, happens, you potentially could have a situation where you have to pay so much in interest on the debt, and it starts to squeeze more and more and more of that total sort of pie chart, right, for lack of a better term. So I'll link to a lot of this stuff, and I was going to call this, how to debate or get into a discussion with your friends about, all this stuff. Maybe I don't know what I'm going to call it yet, but hopefully you found this a little bit helpful. And just kind of looking at some of the facts, and all this stuff is available. All this stuff is, certainly public. You just have to got to know where to look for it. So, all right, we'll come back with the next episode. We're probably going to do something around how the options market behaves right prior to companies releasing earnings, and how something like implied volatility of options prices looks to not necessarily predict, but trying to figure out how volatile the market thinks a certain security or underlying index is. So, all right, with that, I'll leave it there. We'll talk to everyone next week.